How you doing today, EJ?
I'm doing well, Tyrone. Thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks for coming on. Initially, I was having you come on to talk about the Ojulari signing, and you did a full film breakdown, and we'll get to that. But Brandon Graham retires today, and I've been talking about how, like, you know, you're a filmsman and you're like a young vet now covering the team. What do you think? As a guy who covers the team, and you get to see, obviously, BG even more than we get to get to, what do you think it's going to be like for you the first time you have to cover the Eagles with Brandon Graham no longer on the squad?
Yeah, it's going to be strange. You know, I feel like, you know, very fortunate in this job. You get to interact with a lot of special people. You know, to make it to the NFL, it takes a lot, obviously. And, you know, Brandon Graham stands out even among that field of, you know, people, like special people. He is one of the nicest people you'll ever meet. You know, he's very genuine. His perspective on life is just very unique and very profound. And, you know, like listening to him talk today, it really stood out to me. Like, you know, this is a perspective and a positivity that you can only really get from a 15-year career that he's had, you know, and I think it really is remarkable. You know, again, one of the nicest people I've ever covered, one of the most special people I've ever covered. So, you know, it's sad, but I don't think this is the last we'll see of him. You know, I think he will be around the facility. I think he'll probably stay in the media, and, you know, it's well-deserved. You know, I think he's had an unbelievable career, and he really would not have been able to achieve that career without that perspective that he's had and that wisdom that he's had. You know, I think that he offers a lot of value for the Eagles moving forward even because of those traits.
All right, moving to free agency. Obviously, the Eagles have made a bunch of moves and got a lot of guys in the basket. Who stands out to you?
Yeah, it's a good question. Azeez Ojulari is probably the one. You know, I feel like because they have been signing a lot of players that I think are kind of to shore up the depth chart. And I think in general, like their approach of free agency has evolved a little bit in the last few years. I think it's actually a good approach that they have in the sense that they want to make sure that they don't have any holes going into the draft. You know, they want to make sure that they don't have to force picks. And, you know, that's how you can end up prioritizing, you know, whether it's positional value or just drafting the best player possible. So, you know, I think of all the guys that they signed, a lot of those guys fit into that first category. I think they're trying to take flyers on players to, again, shore up the depth chart going into the draft. But I think Ojulari has some real upside. You know, watching his tape, you see some high-level traits, you see some high-level rushes. You know, that's not to say that all of his sack production throughout his career has necessarily been the result of those things. You know, I think sacks can sometimes be, you know, circumstantial. I think, you know, even Brandon Graham talking today about the Super Bowl, the sack he had in the Eagles' first Super Bowl win, you know, he mentioned, like, that the person who took away the first read was really important. I think that Azeez Ojulari definitely benefited from some of that with the sack production. But, you know, with that said, I think that he has, you know, shown some high-level reps that, you know, showed what he is capable of. So I think staying healthy is going to be big for him, but if he does stay healthy, I think he could really factor into the edge rusher rotation. If you ask me about the rest of these guys, I'm not sure how many of them, you know, are going to be regular players for this team, but I could see Azeez Ojulari earning a legitimate role on this defense in pretty short order, again, if he can stay on the field.
You know, it's funny you say that, EJ. Be careful. There are people still on social media using profanity towards me because I said the same thing you just said about how I don't know how many of those guys before Ojulari, I was saying I don't know how many of those guys are actually going to stick. Some of them may not even make the team. So I appreciate you saying it in a more diplomatic way. Following up on that Ojulari thing, how important is it? You mentioned the health reason, the health that as of now, pre-draft. How important would it be for him to take a lot of snaps? Because Ricky and I yesterday were looking at it. We don't know what you can expect from Huff. Obviously, Jalix Hunt, Nolan Smith coming back from injury, but let's assume he's healthy. And you have Jalix Hunt. Based on it, how it is right now, is it important, pre-draft, of course, that he's able to play, you know, 300 snaps next season?
Yeah, you know, I think that they're going to need somebody to do it. You know, I think that that's a good point that you raised, that, you know, the rotation still doesn't really feel like it's got that high-volume player. You know, Nolan Smith, I could see him, you know, obviously taking a much bigger role next season, but at the same time, like, I think Nolan Smith is pretty good on early downs because he's got the mentality for it. You know, he's a tough guy. He plays with a lot of energy, but he's not a conventional early down edge rusher. You know, he's not somebody who you want, you know, taking a bunch of snaps against the run. So, you know, if you think about Josh Sweat, he's a bigger body. You know, he's 6'5", 265 or something like that. So, you know, Nolan Smith is a little bit smaller. I think they still kind of need that. If they don't prioritize it early in the draft, which honestly it still feels like they will, but if they don't, then I think Ojulari is going to have to play some of those snaps that Josh Sweat will vacate. But again, he's not really that type of player either. He's 6'3", 240 pounds. When you watch the tape with the Giants, it's clear that they used him mostly as a designated pass rusher. They didn't have him out on the field on early downs a lot. So I think it's fair to say that position's still incomplete going into the draft. And I think that they are trying to cover their bases so that it's not a glaring need. But I mean, if you ask me like what position are they going to target with their first pick or first 1 or 2 picks in the draft, I do think that edge rusher is a really good bet along with defensive tackle because they still need to fill those positions out. I still think that they have some needs there.
When you look at this team as a whole, obviously the offense is pretty much still intact. The defense, okay, you got a couple holes that you need to fill. But, I mean, when you would look at, if you compared them to the rest of the league, I would say they're still in really good shape going into next year.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think sometimes, I'll admit it, first and foremost, as a beat reporter, you can sometimes get, caught up in the minutia. You get kind of into the micro of the roster, but then you zoom out and it's like, they still have, so much talent on this roster. And that's why their free agency approach has been what it is because not only do they have a lot of players making a lot of money and a lot of talented players at that making a lot of money, it's not like these deals are bad deals. These are actually probably cost-effective deals when you look at guys like A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, Jalen Hurts, Landon Dickerson, Lane Johnson, all these guys, they make big money and they deserve it because they're some of the best at their position. I think that, when you zoom out, this team is still easily one of the best teams in the NFC. I think that in the NFL, I think that it's just a matter of, working around the margins and trying to maximize what they can, and I think that they've done a decent job of that. I think the draft is going to be really important. And then again, like Howie Roseman's always going to remind people, like, the offseason it's a long offseason. You think about Mekhi Becton, he got signed after the draft. So, I still think that they are in a really good position. And I meant to mention, like, even the guys they have on rookie contracts, they're going to have to pay them coming up, which is part of their free agency approach. But, like, they have 2 stud cornerbacks, like, they have so much talent on this team. I think that it is, like, easy to look at it. It's easy to get caught up in some of these signings and wonder how much better they're getting, but it's also important to remember this team just won the Super Bowl, and they're keeping, most of the key contributors from that team, intact.
We're speaking with E.J. Smith. He does a tremendous job covering the Eagles for the Inquirer. Looking forward to the draft, not at specific players. You mentioned them targeting defensive linemen, maybe with the first 2 picks. Is it also, though, a little bit dangerous to go in, and I know you're covering, you mentioned you want to cover, as much as of the roster you can so you don't have to draft for need, but is it a little bit risky to be relying on first-round picks and second-round picks in year 1 to contribute big, regardless of how well you draft, just because you usually don't find a Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean in the first 2 rounds every single year?
Yeah, I definitely think that's true at defensive tackle especially. Those guys don't usually come right into the league and set the world on fire. Jalen Carter, was obviously kind of the exception to that, but even his production his rookie season, wasn't necessarily what it was last year. So I think it usually, and again, usually guys take even longer than that. Usually it's 3 or 4 years before you really see the finished product on the interior. I feel like with edge rusher, it kind of depends on the guy. Some guys have a higher floor. But, yeah, I mean, I do think that, going into the season, banking on a first-round pick being like a major snap getter at edge rusher, it might be risky, but kind of, going back to what Ricky said, like, this is a really talented defense, even without that. Even if they do end up with, an edge rusher rotation that doesn't get boosted in the draft, like, you still look at this defense and feel pretty good about the amount of talent that they have. And I think one thing that we got to remember is, like, we've seen a lot of Eagles defenses that are constructed around the pass rush and constructed around the edge rusher rotation. But I think that this defense is going to be constructed more around, I mean, think about it, like, they're paying Zach Bond $17 million a year. That has to come from somewhere, like, there's a balancing act that has to happen there. So, I think that will happen at safety and probably maybe even edge rusher, depending on how the draft goes. And again, I don't think that necessarily means that the defense is going to take a step back. I think that, it is just a matter of they're going to have to build it a little bit differently because they do have some guys under contract, like Zach Bond, who are going to be kind of changing the equation. I still think it could be an elite defense, but I think it's going to be leaning on maybe different positions than we're used to.
I got to ask you, was there really that much out there for the Eagles to go after in this free agency, considering when you look down and a lot of the biggest free agent picks were Eagles that were actually in this free agent group.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I mean, I think the consensus going into free agency is that it wasn't the best free agency class. I mean, I had Azeez Ojulari as one of the players that made sense for the Eagles. Now, I thought he would command a more competitive market than he did. I don't know if it's, the circumstances around some of his production. I don't know. It's probably just his injury history, but the league clearly had a different evaluation of him. So I think that explains why he kind of hung around in free agency and why he signed the deal with the Eagles that he ultimately did. But yeah, I think that there were very few. I mean, I remember when I was going through, I always do like free agents that might make sense for the Eagles the week before the free agency actually opens. And, it was harder to find names this year for sure because, you knew their cap situation was going to be what it was. But I think you also, knew that there just weren't a lot of great options out there. So, yeah, I always think that, like, the team that wins free agency doesn't typically win a lot of games the next season. It's kind of a buyer beware situation. When teams let these guys enter free agency, there's usually a reason for it. So, yeah, I don't think it's necessarily, it's not always a bad thing that your team's not active in free agency for sure.
Well, EJ, we really appreciate the time. People should go to Inquirer.com/sports and look at your whole film review. I noticed out of those 6 sacks, 4 of them came in 2 games. You show all of the sacks, though. Great job with that. I told you he's a filmsman. People should go check out your Ojulari film review there. That was really good work today. I appreciate you.
Appreciate that, Tyrone. Thanks for having me, guys.
All right, man. Talk to you soon. That was EJ Smith on the Comcast Business Hotline. Yeah. So he broke it down. Yeah. So he has. Thanks so much, everybody, for watching. Really appreciate it. If you want more of this content, make sure you like and subscribe. And you can do that kind of over here if you want more of the best show ever.